ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. We are pleased to have with us today Craig Barnes-Smith, who's with the Spiritual Computing Research Institute. I'll leave it to Craig to give us a little bit more detail on his background and what he's been working on lately, but I was privileged enough to meet Greg at Food Camper, who led a session on spiritual computing and what does that mean and what are the implications for work done by computer scientists. So the reason that Craig's come here today is to talk to us a little bit about what our thoughts are on that topic, and also to see if there are any Googlers who would be interested in working on research of this kind or getting a group together here to talk about topics like this. So, welcome to Craig.
Thank you. It's always interesting to see who would show up in a meeting that brings these two words together. It's pretty weird, right? Spiritual and computing. You may be here just because you're curious about what could come out of those two words, but you might have a more specific idea yourself. So I'd be interested to know what connections you see with what might be spiritual computing, or what you're doing here at Google that might be potentially connected with that topic. I just really like to hear from you. Just any ideas? Yeah.
So there's the Kurzweil book.
Yeah.
Spiritual computing. So that's what drew me into the title of the talk. I was like, I wonder if he's talking about this, and it's not really the same thing.
Yeah. So Ray Kurzweil, The Age of Spiritual Machines. Yeah, that's definitely something I'll talk about. Anybody else about how this topic may relate to what goes on here at Google? Yeah?
Well, Google has this don't be evil sort of notion. I think morality and spirituality are somehow related.
Right. So there's an ethical dimension of this, surely. Okay. Well, let me just start. But first of all, to say something about myself, as Leslie requested. I put in about a decade exploring how the technology sector might be contributing to humanity or harming as digital technology takes over and as networks spread. What's the social impact of that? What are the net pluses and minuses as we get from the first to the second billion network individuals? I explored that by helping to create a movement to close the digital divide. I organized a conference in 1999 on the eve of the Seattle World Trade Organization meeting that brought world leaders together around that topic. Since then, I've been teaching that topic at Harvard and advising governments in Asia about how to spread networks into their countries. And it led me to understand that this issue of how to bring out the potential for digital technology for human benefit is not something that's going to be worked out by government leaders. It is so deep, the issue is so pervasive that it does have to be worked out on a spiritual level, essentially. The issues that are arising as digital technology enhances its impact on human culture is at its heart a matter of affecting the very nature of what it means to be human and what it means for humans to shape reality that brings out the potential of the human condition. So all those issues are essentially spiritual issues. And so I spent about 10 years looking at the social impact of technology, and now I see that it's led me to this spiritual terrain. But this is not the first time that an exploration like this has taken place. I could draw your attention to a situation that happened 2,500 years ago when someone was born into a wealthy family and offered a lot of material rewards for sort of going along with the father's agenda. But instead, this guy dropped out sort of totally rejected his parents' solution for what would bring happiness. And he decided to launch his own investigation into this question himself. And he essentially ended up developing a technology called openness, in which he explored the methods of actually cracking the code on how a human can achieve sustainable happiness or empowerment, user empowerment. And once he made this discovery, he didn't feel a need to patent it. He did because he wasn't motivated in that way. And yet, the discovery he made might be considered the ultimate original open source discovery, that there's a way for the mind to work out how to be happy. And then he began to tell others about it. So this person, you might guess by now, is who? What? The Buddha, right. But now I'm not, but having said that, I don't want you to think that I'm, pushing a Buddhist agenda on you guys. The Buddha lived at a time that is now being referred to as the axial age, or the age of transformation. It's a period that began about 800 AD or BC and continued to about 200 AD. And this is a period where most of the significant ideas in the realm of spirituality were really presented in the form of individuals who revisited their own traditions, whether it was sort of Greek rationalism or the Hebrew traditions or whatever, and they began to explore how these traditions can form the basis of technologies that generate empowerment, human empowerment. So these people, Christ, Muhammad, Confucius, Lao Tzu, some of the Greek thinkers, they all lived around the same period of time, and they all came up with complementary answers to the question of how humans could be empowered. And then religions grew up in their way, but these religions didn't always do a good job as stewards of the spiritual experience of these great spiritual adepts. But we do have religions sort of trying to carry forward the legacy of these great leaders. And we've seen that since the time of the axial age, the spiritual impulse, that desire to crack the code on how to adjust your mind in such a way that you become happy, that tradition has been at odds with the tradition of technology. Technology has wedded itself with authoritarian governments and tyrannies and with commerce in such a way as to lead people away from that pursuit of happiness. So human culture in the last several thousand years, have had technology moving in one direction and spirituality moving in another.
Could you press an example of a counterexample of this? Is it unusual? Is the printing press unusual as a counterexample of this?
There have been counterexamples, and that's a good point. That even though these trends have existed, that over time, gradually we've seen the technology world and the spiritual world beginning to hint that there might be a convergent point, a meeting point between these two worlds. And as digital technology was born about 30 plus years ago, the terms like icon or avatar or names like oracle, suggesting that there's some kind of spiritual underpinning to what might be going on here in digital technology began to emerge. But I think it's only now, in the year 2006, where the preconditions exist for a real alignment between the worlds of technology and the worlds of spirituality. And it relates very much to what's going on here in this room and in this incredible place called Google. It's the search business, right? So search, what is it? It's about aggregating information, but is that the end game? How does information get us to meaningful information? And how does meaning get us to wisdom? And how does wisdom get us to empowerment? Has become central to the search business. So search by itself exists in a larger context of what is it that people really want, and what does it mean for people to embark on a search process to get the answers to questions that they don't think they already have, and how does that then lead them into a dynamic where they actually find that what they want is what the Buddha wanted, sustainable happiness? Is there some way that through the search business that can be aligned with this historic effort to find true meaning in life? It seems that yes?
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt.
Yeah.
I have a hypothesis.
Yeah?
That there is, this isn't completely off the top of my head hypothesis, so I may get to the end of my sentence and say, no, that's wrong. So much as there is, a natural ecology of, so I think there's an information ecology that exists in a changed landscape. So historically, here's a biological metaphor. Historically, our ancestors had to hunt and scrape for enough calories to survive. We are evolved to take in all of the calories we possibly can because there's never been enough. And now, of course, that there is too much, there are calories everywhere. We all have dietary problems and we need nutritionists. Historically, information has been power. There hasn't ever been enough of it. It would be really useful to know whether there's a leopard over that hill. It would be useful to know, all of these things. And I think intellectually, we have evolved the same mechanisms for this hunger for information that our bodies have evolved for a hunger for calories. Essentially, the more we can get, the better. The more likely we are to survive. And we have our brains haven't adapted to these last 20 years.
Yeah.
And we need the equivalent of information nutritionists to say, no, clicking on the trivial quote of the day 15 times isn't good for you.
Good point. Very good point. Well, to kind of set up this discussion further, I'd like to just refer to some of the precursors for this alignment between technology and spirituality to see what might help us get some indication that what might come out of this space in which these two worlds come together. For example, think of the experience of George Lucas, the filmmaker, 30 years ago. He was, I think a roommate of Francis Ford Coppola out of the USC Film School, and they were dreaming as young, idealistic men about creating an alternative to the Hollywood studio system. But Lucas understood that he also needed to know a lot about technology and what technology can do with film. So he brought a lot of those tools with him up to the Marin County where he established his base away from the Hollywood star system. And he began to work on the script for Star Wars. And he worked on several versions of it, and he couldn't quite get a compelling story because he knew he wanted it to be about search, but he knew that it had to be search for what. So he read this book he found called Hero with a Thousand Faces, written by who? Joseph Campbell. Joseph Campbell is one of those people who himself is an innovator, but in the other world, the world of spirituality. And he has seen a kind of alignment between what's been going on in these spiritual traditions and say, Jungian psychology, the concept of archetype. And he began to see a pattern here, that humans have intrinsically the desire for search for meaning. And it's called a hero's journey, that one begins the search with some kind of sense of renunciation, that you don't have the answers. You have to go out to find it. You go out with questions, you get those questions answered, but at the same time, in the process, you get power. You become empowered. And the empowerment that you find is ultimately about letting go of your own ego control and opening to the larger potential for good. So he got from Joseph Campbell the story that became Luke Skywalker's empowerment, and how he then, Luke Skywalker himself understood that to defeat the dark force out there, he had to find the basis of his own confidence. He had to find a balance between being focused and aware of the context, his experience. And of course, as the Star Wars franchise became an enormous commercial success, it actually is one of the, still probably the most successful commercial breakthrough. So it's not as if this spiritual quest idea is antithetical to network effects, but it does seem to involve design principles where you factor in spiritual wisdom so that begins to dominate what you do with these tools that digital technology has created. So 30 years ago, we had a conversation between two individuals that was kind of like a blip in the film industry. It didn't actually create an alternative to the star system. Maybe Robert Redford has, who knows. But the time wasn't right 30 years ago. But there are two other men whose lives I want to mention that have actually brought us right at the doorstep of this convergence that we find right here happening in Silicon Valley now. One of the men was working on the spiritual side of the equation, and the other on the technology side. First, for the spiritual side, there's this guy named Francisco Varela. Have any of you heard his name? A Chilean. Well, he was a student, a young student of an esteemed biologist named Humberto Maturana, who came up with the notion of autopoiesis, which is a concept of self-organized systems. It's that based on the biology of the cell, that the cell exists of sort of semi-autonomous parts that form a kind of ecology. This notion became the basis of questioning for Francisco, and he felt he had to leave Santiago and go study with spiritual masters. He found Tibetan Buddhism, he found the Dalai Lama. He began to see that in Tibetan Buddhism, one can begin to see how brain systems can come into convergence. Affective and cognitive dimensions of one's brain could sort of come together through meditation. So in a dialogue with the Dalai Lama, he eventually brought that dialogue into neuroscience. This led to, and he brought it to, he revisited the French existential and phenomenological tradition He lived the last 10 years of his life in Paris. Unfortunately, he died rather young, about 5 years ago. But he articulated a notion called first-person science, the notion that experience itself is a kind of, could be the basis of empirical inquiry, and it could lead and it could inform design principles by becoming an expert on experience. And he also talked about how the third-person science of neuroscience could study meditation adepts and use fMRI technology, the visual kind of scanning technology, to indicate what empowerment actually looks like as a brain image, and measures could be developed to delineate the empowered brain from the less empowered brain. So right now at neuroscience labs like University of Wisconsin, Stanford, University of California, San Diego, we have meditation becoming a serious object of inquiry, so that we're beginning to see what optimal brain health looks like. We're beginning to see what it is that these spiritual traditions have been aiming for in terms of brain systems. And surprise, surprise, we're beginning to get measures that the technology labs can use as they seek to optimize user experience. So neuroscience has made a connection with spiritual traditions that has great implications for technology. And it's because of the spiritual quest of people like Francisco Varela. Their own seeking process has led them to this, so that Francisco, at the end of his life, was able to tell his mentor that he helped carry that tradition of autopoiesis, and that wonderful tradition of Chileans like Pablo Neruda. He was able to kind of bring the jewels back to Chile and return to his own people the insight from his own journey. Now we also have another person who lived right around here at Stanford, Palo Alto, Xerox Park, who you probably do know, Mark Weiser. Anybody know Mark Weiser? Who he is? Tell us who is Mark Weiser, or who was he? Yeah.
He was the head of the, I forget what the lab was originally called, but it was the lab at Xerox that ended up working on ubiquitous computing at Xerox.
Right. So he was a contemporary of Francisco's, and he died at about the same age, rather young. Both of them died of cancer about several years ago. Mark Weiser came out of this incredible collection of people at the Xerox PARC lab in Palo Alto. And there was this was a time and place where design principles were emerging that are still now, that are changing, that are bringing out the potential of what digital technology might contribute. So Weiser never developed a lot of books or anything, but he wrote 2 articles that have had enormous effects. One of them was on the concept of invisible technology, which was basically the notion that computing isn't essentially a matter of me sitting here in front of this machine and this sort of cognitive lock between this TV-like box and me over here, in which all my energy is very kind of visual, and we're trying to find a solution. It's not about that necessarily, but he talked about a world in which technology can become invisible, get out of the way, become embedded in objects, and the whole body becomes sort of freed in the way that it's mediated by technology. So Weiser formed the basis of what is now, goes by several names. One of them is ubiquitous technology, pervasive technology, locative technology, a world in which the real-life physical world of atoms converges with the virtual world, and out of that comes an enhancement of human freedom. he articulated this potential even as the commercial forces around him were still focusing on technology as a productivity tool. He was looking ahead about how technology could be an empowering tool. He also wrote a book called Calm Technologies. Have any of you heard of that article? You might want to Google it. Calm Technology is an amazing visionary piece of work. It's just a few pages long. But in Calm Technology, he said that the fundamental challenge of computing is to restructure the relationship between focus and or what's at the center of your attention and what's at the periphery. So, and this, of course, is a really fundamental notion in meditation or in spiritual traditions, is how you keep focus and still let in context. You know, it's also relates to spiritual search, right? Because you have an idea of what you want to hold on to that, and yet new things arise that you didn't count on coming in from the periphery. So Weiser explored this only at a primitive level by thinking about how objects could remind you of things gently in the periphery, how you could be given gentle reminders of things. But this notion that technology could help you manage attention so that you were not overwhelmed by information overload, but that it actually helped you achieve mindful focus, while at the same time, in an appropriate way, open you to context. This is like a fundamental insight that we'll be working with in the next 10 years in innovation in computing. All this is from the work of this guy at Xerox PARC, and many of his proteges at Xerox PARC are doing incredible work now. So there have been, if you look on the globe, you'll see different points of innovation. Some of them up in Finland with Linus Torvalds, and some of them out of MIT, and some here, some there. Little hints of what it might mean to bring the world of spirituality and technology together. And hey, this is new. This hasn't been talked about. We don't have the seminal book on this. And speaking of Ray Kurzweil, who was it that meant you were? In 1999, he's an inventor. He's an engineering guy, and he can be forgiven for taking the approach that he has, because he's been in this self-enclosed engineering world where he hasn't really known that there's a realm of expertise called spirituality. So he can write a book called The Age of Spiritual Machines as if he almost invented the word spiritual. And that's what he did in 1999. And he talked about a world of the law of accelerating returns, predictable innovation, where we will get to three-dimensional semiconductors and so forth. And essentially we'll get to machines that are smarter than humans. And so out of this, he thought that maybe we all might make choices to download parts of our brain when they start to wear out, and we'll achieve some kind of immortality. And we can call that spiritual machines, that we'll all become spiritual machines voluntarily. I'm sorry, but this doesn't sound like spirituality to me. Because that guy, Joseph Campbell, the one that inspired George Lucas, the first thing he said to George was, George, you know what spirituality is about? It happens as soon as you realize that you've only got so long to live, and you want to make that period of time meaningful. And so it pushes you into questions about the nature of your own existence, so that by the time you die, you can really let go. This is not the Kurzweilian vision of the future, I'm sorry. So when spirituality meets technology, it's a space that really hasn't been opened yet.
So I guess I take issue with the argument that that mortality is linked to spirituality. I think there are just as many issues raised by the question of okay, I'm going to live forever. What I think it's, if somebody told you that you were going to live forever, I think that raises just as many questions. I'd say, I don't know, spirituality to me feels more to be any form of interest, anything that, any form of introspection on self-consciousness and existence.
Yeah.
And I guess, whether it's sort of like flipping a coin. You flip a coin and either, yes, you're going to die someday, or yes, you're going to live forever. Just flipping the coin is an act of, or knowing that there's going to be an answer there, one way or the other.
Okay.
Is a
That's a
spiritual
good point.
act.
That's a good point, and I think that the implications of your point is that technology is being forced to ask fundamental questions in order to address its own future. Questions about the human condition, which have been outside the field of engineering in the past. Engineers have been those people who didn't have to ask those fundamental questions. They could just go ahead and do practical things without having to get too deeply into philosophy. But now maybe we have to begin to inquire more deeply. And I think if we draw expertise from spiritual traditions of all kinds, they will tell us that facing one's own death is a part of the equation. But
there's also part of this in like radical AI and like mind uploading. You have to call in a serious question: what is you? And I think that's some of the attractive side of this kind of inquiry. What would I be? Take away my body, take away my maybe motor or brain function things. Yeah, I mean, I agree with Chris. While I can use some bad terms, but there's some very fascist kind of things going on in this line of technology, but it's still interesting.
it is interesting, and I think you're right that the question of what is you, is at the core, and maybe he's being just a trickster, provocative to get us thinking about what is who we are, and essentially another framework here we could think of as Web 2.0. We're all familiar, everyone here is familiar with Web 2.0? Pretty much. You know how the concept, someone define Web 2.0 for us.
Web 2.0, unfortunately, is mostly a marketing term and means whatever saying it means it to mean. So I think if you're going to talk about it, maybe it would be more helpful if you would define what you mean by it.
Okay. Well, obviously it came out of Tim O'Reilly's interactions and his conferences and so forth, in trying to try to find a framework to explain why some websites have really taken off after the dot-com bust and others haven't. And then they've tried to somehow articulate the principles that define which sites have been able to achieve great network effects and what could explain that. And so they've aggregated a few trend areas in this field, like social computing and the kind of notion of that what seems to be going on here has to do with freeing the end user to become more active and participatory, and sites that trigger the engagement of the end user, sort of architectures of participation. And of course, that notion then seems to have struck some kind of chord. Obviously, it's been used as a marketing tool, but it's a notion that was simply mentioned in a roundtable conversation like this only a couple years ago, and now if you do a Google search on it, there'll be 126 million references to that term. So there's a suggestion that maybe, I mean, if you put quotes around it, maybe there's something there, that the notion that sites that aggregate user experience, users, and lead them into meaningful experience might be really central to the future of computing. And indeed, most of the laboratories that I've been visiting are seeing that they're ultimately in the experience business, not the device business or the software business, and that their challenge is to develop more compelling experiences than their competitors. And compelling can mean meaningful, and meaningful can mean empowering. So it may be that the technology sector, by the dynamics of technological innovation itself, may be leading into the spirituality conversation about what empowerment might mean, what the nature of experience might mean. And these are topics that have been the subject of intense empirical investigation for thousands of years. So maybe there is a meeting point in which definitions of things could be worked out and hypotheses and ideas could emerge as those two notions can now be brought into the same, two cultures really can be brought into the same conversation. Yes?
I was just wondering if you knew of any women that were prominent.
Any what?
Women that were prominent in this field?
You know, I think it's a field that is yet to be born. But in terms of precursors to it, certainly on the spiritual side of the equation, some of the great spiritual innovators have been women. On the technology side, nothing right now comes to mind, but it's a good question, important question. So there are several streams of research that I think are coming together in a framework for spiritual computing. One is gaming. So the notion of spiritual quest as incorporated into gaming, and how gaming, the experience of gaming, could lead to more meaningful and empowering experiences where we'll probably see the first applications of spiritual computing. There's also ways in which different user groups, like healthcare systems as users, education as users, how they will incorporate technologies that engage users. For example, biofeedback that targets attention of a patient so that they can begin to heal themselves in a very targeted way, using new interfaces. This will certainly arise in healthcare. We will, as affective computing matures and as computers are able to sense the emotional state of users and users are able to influence machines to detect their own emotional state, we'll see more opportunities for conveying empowering experiences in all types of technology. So as I've been going around the world, beginning with Nokia in Finland, and having these kinds of conversations. And in each company, in each laboratory, sometimes academic labs, sometimes corporate labs, sometimes no lab at all like this, but just a corporate conversation. It seems that when you open a space to bring these two terms together, ideas seem to arise. People seem to have ideas that can come to the surface. So for the most part, what spiritual computing is just a way of structuring that conversation so that ideas can emerge in that space. And women and men can begin to formulate applications, design principles, processes that could lead to new technologies, products, services, and experiences that come out of the convergence of those two worlds. So this process is involved in formulating a spiritual computing research group. Nokia is the first partner. Microsoft is coming involved, kicking and screaming, perhaps, but one finds in a company like Microsoft several streams of research that's leading them into concepts like sacred space built into the home of the future. Religion, how to reach out to the religion as a kind of user category and create technology that bring religion, that address the spiritual principles embedded in religion, or the spiritual experiences in religion. Right now I'd just like to open the discussion up. Any questions, any notions about how any of these ideas might relate back to what's going on at Google and your own work, your own lives?
Please help me understand a distinction I think I hear you drawing between enabling an empowerment versus mere productivity and technologies. Where is there a fuzzy line there? Are you drawing a distinction? Is there? How do you see that?
Well, going back to Tim O'Reilly and Web 2.0, I think one of the common themes he saw in the sites that were compelling to users is that they're not based on productivity enhancement, but on eliciting creativity or engagement. That's behind the blogging phenomenon, Flickr and so forth, how it's addressing aspects of one's life that don't directly involve productivity enhancement as the primary driver. That could be questioned perhaps, but clearly we're seeing the potential for digital technology to affect lives in ways that go beyond productivity as the end game. With spiritual traditions, clearly one has to have a certain level of economic development or confidence in order to embark on these questions of human quality of life. But yeah, we're mostly talking about looking beyond productivity as the purpose of technology when we talk about spiritual computing. Yes?
I went back to your notion about search and search leading to meaning and then finding the wisdom, because Cass Sunstein actually came here last week and explained that although now with the internet and search capability we can have a vast array of information available to us, what he's noticed is that people now search out for information that they already agree with, that reinforces their previous held beliefs, and that instead of empowering them, they're just simply reinforcing what they already believe, which is probably not empowering at all. So I wanted to get your thoughts about this phenomenon and where do you see a solution to that?
Yeah, I don't have the solution to that, but I would be very interesting to know what you guys think about this. That is, there's some way that design refinements could come to the searching industry so that information gathering could lead to meaningful learning that might go beyond simply, how you go from aggregating information to aggregating intelligence or meaning. Any of you have ideas about that? Perhaps you do. Uh-huh.
I'm still, there's something I'm still uncertain of the focus. I think it's maybe a rephrasing of your question of just, I'm seeing a spectrum, in fact, in what you're proposing. One, let me see if I can drag things back a few thousand years, to where one direction is making, well, I'll say, making technology serve spirituality versus making technology more spiritual or more holistic. So for making technology serve spirituality, for example, Islam gave us modern astronomy because they needed to predict exactly when the new moon would start, and that required developing math and understanding of a lot of understanding of science and technology that we just didn't have, and that essentially made it possible for early Muslims to figure out when is it we're going to have the new moon, when is it that sunrise is going to happen, and that was taking technology and essentially making it serve that particular spirituality, versus, as you say, calm computing, which isn't 1,000 years ago. But essentially, this is taking cold hard technology and making it a little bit more humane. And these seem to me to be very fundamentally different tasks. And I'm not sure if you're, I don't know which of these you're getting at.
Well, it's opening a space in which all can be considered, and to going beyond. It's not essentially about serving religion as a user group and figuring out how technology can reinvent all the various functions that happen in religion. But right, it's more about trying to understand what the experiences that have emerged from spiritual traditions that are relevant to the technology sector, and how a dialogue or interface could be developed between that realm of expertise and what the technologists are trying to do. Now, out of that could come concepts like the democratization of spirituality. What may emerge as a definition of spirituality could be, meaningful spiritual inquiry could be more widespread as network effects take over in ways that affect religion and as well as secular expressions of spirituality. So effects could be seen in the spiritual realm, but they also could be seen in the design processes that affect the next generation of technologies, even if the effect isn't deliberately spiritual. The effect may be simply to build loyalty among users, or to lead users towards experiences that they consider to be meaningful, and helping them manage information overload, for example. Like if you look at the future of technology, where digital sensor networks will be distributed everywhere, consumers will have an incentive to manage information and to address information overload and to find their own relationship to this issue of how they can be empowered to shape the way in which they process information and find meaning from it. So the effects can be felt on both sides of that conversation in ways that influence the direction on both sides. But maybe the other answer to your question is that it is totally an open space, what comes out of a way of structuring a dialogue that brings those two worlds together.
There's a couple things that I think are going on in the company that are less difficult to kind of phrase. I think zeitgeist is kind of an interesting overflow to explain German word, like spirit of culture.
Yeah.
So, that's one of the things. And I also think it's kind of interesting that when you have like intercultural issues that come up, like when you're doing translation or maps and things like this, like these are spaces that you don't really know how to grapple with so well. This needs to be more spiritual oriented. But I also want to say about search, one of the things that's nice about search is it doesn't make a lot of assumptions about what you want to know or how you want to know it. And I think it's the lack of structure that's kind of appealing when you use search. Otherwise, you want to use something like DMOS or ontology or taxonomy. So, to the extent that you already know what you want to see, you go to something that kind of reinforces it. But when you're searching, it's even in the GUI of Google, it's a blank page. There's nothing there, and it's kind of like, it's not challenging. I think that's one of the attractive things, like going back to the Web 2.0 thing. It's like different than like the MTV market, where there's a lot of stuff pushed at you. This tends to me kind of is a big distinction between what people are looking for. If you want to be given something and you don't know to think about it, you can go to one kind of site, a push kind of site. You go to a search site for something, even that's not like a D model. You go to just anything very unstructured. You kind of are trying to escape a lot of these maybe the assumptions that are going on. But that kind of creates tension for spirituality.
You don't think push and pull can come together?
Oh, I do, but I think that there's anarchy rules more than spirituality
Okay.
at this point.
Okay.
And that's kind of funny, right? And this is like, I think it was like when we were setting out the kind of tensions between technology and spirituality. I think there's a well-deserved kind of contempt for some of the bad facets of spirituality in the past. This source of a lot of breakaway for technologists, like if you look at like Galileo, I think he was having conversations with the Pope at the time that he was publishing his writings. He really cared about trying to keep it legit and everything, but eventually he was just like, screw it, I can't do it. I need to say these things. He got persecuted for it. And this is something that I think if you want to bring these things into alignment, you have to legitimize in a certain way to say, well, the techno community is very skeptical of the religious and spiritual communities because of this rift that happened, and to bring it back together, I think that's kind of one of the things that I think that
Yeah.
I think that's more that highlights the rift more between religion and spirituality though than between technology and spirituality.
But without a common framework for engaging in spirituality, people have been cast into anarchy. It's not necessarily a bad thing. I don't think that we lose our spiritual purpose. But it's a hard road. Like in Hinduism, they talk about yoga. It's like ways of going through life because it's confusing, right? I mean, it's like being a technologist and not having the right tools. If you don't have some guidance and that's what the coach can give you, then you may plod through life and not make these discoveries. So,
Yeah. I think that partly what's going on is that we're speaking as sort of modernists who have been very much, each of us have stories to tell about our dealings with religion. And we've also had this sort of new age versions of spirituality that we've been affected by. But if we look at, say, what has emerged out of 5,000 years of spiritual inquiry in India, this is a rigorous empirical tradition where there have been people arising in that are more iconoclastic and anarchistic than anything the West has seen. These guys have been disruptive of what has come before. And there is the innovation that has emerged over those 5,000 years has been very radical. So, because it is driven by this desire to get to what humans want and to find that out without necessarily beginning with a priori some kind of ethical framework. But it's an empirical tradition. So it's a matter of our learning what that is and mixing it up and challenging,
Yeah.
back and forth.
That's why I wanted to bring up the intercultural thing, because I think while that stuff is cool, it doesn't really solve the Western problem. And the Western problem is it's kind of like an in-house problem, where the strip came up and we need to solve it. And what's cool about the web and like looking at other cultures is you kind of see positive examples where this stuff didn't really fall apart quite so badly when these inquiries had, or like in Islam, you know, when people were studying these things, it's one of these great things where you have like, you know, great science happening alongside great religion. And it's instructive, but I think in a certain, at least for the Western culture, it has to be back at a certain point to help us heal our stuff, you know. Like learning somebody else's traditions, it's not necessarily a replacement for your own traditions. It can help as technologies, maybe they're slightly pluggable, but you know, big question you ask. But that may just be how, you know, it's an interesting thing, like, you know, why does a technology or website succeed in China versus here? You know, these can play into like business questions, like, do we not treat the process with certain right or something like this?
Leslie?
Actually, I just wanted to point out that it is past 11:30, so we need to get out of work. So anyone
Okay.
who would like to continue this discussion over lunch, we've got a table reserved in Charlie's, so come on down and hang out with us.
Yeah, thank you.